Hello, and welcome to the webinar, The Evolutionary Stages of BI Governance. My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a few administrative details to share with you, and then we'll dig into our discussion. First, we'd like to thank Metric Insights for their partnership with today's event. They've been wonderful thought leadership partners to Argyle and are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. So thank you again to Metric Insights. We appreciate your joining us today. We welcome you to stay connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please follow us on Twitter at Argyle Exec Forum. I also wanted to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we've curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. Argyle is very proud and protective of this policy, as it reflects our commitment to ensure the neutrality and overall value of the content presented at our events. We've worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, please submit all questions that come up during today's event into the chat section of the interface. Following the panel discussion, we've set aside time for our speakers to weigh in on these questions. Before we start our discussion, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Mike, why don't we start with you?
So Mike Smitherman, I look after sales and marketing over here at Metric Insights.
I'm Marius Moscovici. I'm the founder and CEO of Metric Insights. Welcome, everyone.
I will share my screen here. Just give me 1 minute. Okay, so we're going to run through some slides and show you some product items, and Marius is going to kick things off.
Okay, so thank you, Mike. So today we're going to talk about the evolutionary stages of BI governance. And before we dive deeper into that, I want you to consider for a moment our own civilization and the evolution that's taken place there and the different stages that we went through. So, if you think about how we evolved from ancient times through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, into the Industrial Revolution, and eventually to where we are today, each of these stages had very distinct characteristics. And they lay the foundation for the following stage. So it was very much an evolutionary process. So whether it's whether you look at an agrarian economy or the way currency was used or trade or the many things scientific discoveries that took place in the Renaissance period that then enabled things that followed an industrial revolution, in each of these phases, there were a unique set of challenges. The organism, sort of the society, formed around solving some of those particular areas. And then the value, the gain that was reached out of that stage then enabled the next stage to be successful. It'd be impossible to think of a scenario where you'd like snap your fingers and go from ancient times to industrial revolution without going through those benefits that accrued during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And the same thing applies to BI governance. It is, in fact, an evolutionary process. And one of the things that we see more often than not, people make as a mistake, and that causes BI governance initiatives to fail, is that they fail to recognize that. And they try to go from zero to this highly evolved, highly governed environment overnight without really recognizing that it is a multi-stage process that requires gains in each stage to be transferred into what you do in the following stage. So in this presentation, what we're going to try to do is lay out for you what are these four stages, how do they relate to business intelligence and BI governance, and how would you recognize whether you're on a particular stage, and what are the characteristics of that stage, what are the challenges associated with that stage, and then give you some very specific actions that you can take that will help you move from that stage into the next stage. And I'll give you sort of the high-level overview, and then Mike will give you some examples of what this looks like, with real situations that are built out within Metric Insights. So with that said, let's move into the different stages. So the first stage is like what we call ancient times, is one where there really isn't much governance to speak of. So you can think of this as a situation where BI governance is fairly new to your organization. And in this scenario, users, things are fairly chaotic. People are, there isn't really much in the way of structure around how people access content. Maybe each user is going to a particular tool that they use. There might be multiple tools. Each of them has their own access point. There are lots of PDFs and Excels flying around which people are sharing via email. There's no automated way to collaborate around that content. And so there's quite a bit of chaos in the way things are consumed, and that generates a fair amount of confusion. So the challenges in this early stage is that users don't necessarily know where to go to get their content. This is especially true for those users who are starting out in an organization. Maybe they're new to their role and they are trying to figure out how do they get their analytics. They're not, unless they know someone to speak to who can guide them, they're not going to know where to find the things they need to do their job. And as a result, there's fairly low engagement and satisfaction around business intelligence within the BI community. And what you're seeing from an analyst perspective is that because users don't know where to find content, self-service is fairly limited. And so analysts are fighting fires all the time. They're responding to user inquiries, go get me this, where do I find this report? And then they're scrambling in a very reactive model. So what do you do at this stage to really bring governance into an organization? You're really starting almost from ground zero. So you want to make small incremental steps here. Organizations not going to be ready at this stage for a lot of effort where you're asking lots of people in the organization to contribute huge amounts towards governance. You can't do that. It's too big of a first step. But you can take an incremental first step, especially if that step is measured in that it does not require lots of effort from the rest of the organization. So what does that look like? Well, first, you want to pull all the content into a single portal, right? Take out all the different access points, whether I'm looking at using an Excel or a PDF or Power BI or Tableau or whatever tool I'm using to go after my analytics. I should have one place to go and find that content, to be able to search for it and engage with it. So simplifying that access creates that first foundational layer of governance. Then I need to be able to synchronize my content into that portal. So I don't want a situation where I have thousands of pieces of content that have to be individually registered into a portal, because that's going to be too much effort. Nobody's going to want to go do that. So I need to be able to have a mechanism by which content can simply flow into that portal from the places where it exists today, the BI repositories you have, the SharePoint repositories, maybe file system shares, and so that it just gets cataloged in a very simple way right within that environment. And then I need to allow the content publishers to be able to easily publish the content that they want to make visible to users. Because obviously, if you take everything that you have in SharePoint, you put it all into your portal, well, that's going to create a huge amount of clutter. So you want to be able to bring that content in, but then allow through a very simple, lightweight publishing mechanism to give your content publishers the ability to say, out of these 20 pieces of content, these 3 are current and relevant, and I want to make them available for my users to see. These other ones, let's not include them because they represent obsolete content or content that is duplicative, or things that we don't want users to stumble into and get the wrong idea around how they should engage it. So, putting these 3 pieces together, you're just basically forming the very foundation of governance. And Mike is going to show you some examples of what this looks like in action.
Yeah, thanks, Marius. So as Marius said, I'm going to take you into, obviously, the Metric Insights platform here, but think of this, in terms of how you might want to look at a technical solution to what Marius has been talking about. So really those 3 things let's touch on. So what you're looking at here is an example of what a single portal, a single catalog of content might look like in your environment. And the key aspects of this is that it's able to connect to all sources of data or all sources of BI in your organization, whether that's because you are running multiple BI platforms, whether you're still publishing things, say, in spreadsheets or documents up on a SharePoint or file share, whether you have reporting in your operational applications, a portal needs to be able to essentially link into all those sources of BI that some user may be interested in. And in synchronizing that we'll look at in a minute into metric insights, to the user, they don't really care where this content exists. The key point is that they can access it in one place. So each of these tiles that you're looking at here is a particular report or dashboard that we've synchronized. It's organized in a way that makes sense for your organization. So hiding the complexities of how things are organized in the underlying tools to give sort of this single category structure for your users. And if a user drills into a piece of content, such as this Tableau sales analysis dashboard here, we want to keep them in the same environment. We want to make sure that they can interact with that content as if they were in the underlying tools. So in this case, we're embedding a Tableau dashboard within the portal. And as the user, we're logging me in with a single sign-on, and I can interact with this piece of content directly here. And so whether it's I'm looking at the Tableau dashboard, whether it's I'm drilling into a Power BI dashboard, the experience to the user is seamless. The experience to the user is that they don't have to understand the complexities of the underlying technology. So bringing things together into this sort of centralized catalog. And as an end user, if I just switch across to another browser here, ensuring that you link your catalog up to your sort of security and permissions that you have in place today, so that when a user, in this case Sam, logs in, they're only going to be browsing through the content that is relevant to them. So that's probably in terms of a subset of the categories and folders, a subset of the tiles, or even a subset of the underlying data sources that are interesting to them. Now, Marius mentioned sort of the concept of getting the content in here. The last thing you want to do when you're centralizing content for users is to sort of replicate the clutter from each underlying system into the centralized place. So a portal should be able to effectively connect to any sources of information, as we've spoken about before. So in this case, looking at the plugin that we have to Power BI in this case. And
so at this point, you should have enabled users to get one access point, a single access point to every analytic, irrespective of what type it is. So it's greatly simplified that process. Basically make it easy for content to be adopted to the portal. So the mechanism that Mike showed, where it should be synchronized automatically, and yet have a basic level of governance where a content publisher can separate the items that should be visible to users from those that should not, because they're so declutter the entire environment. So essentially lay the foundation for governance in this stage. So now, the next stage, in the Middle Ages, if you like, now you're starting off in an environment where content is centralized, but governance, while it exists, it is somewhat ad hoc. You have different content publishers. Each publisher may be using different criteria for what gets promoted and what doesn't. And there's really no business participation in the publishing process, right? You've just got the Tableau developer responsible for putting their content up there, but there's not, there isn't really the idea of like somebody independently vetting and saying, yes, this is the content the business should use. And similarly, there's no really managed way to distribute content out. So you could use perhaps content distribution within the underlying BI tool, but if you have multiple tools, there isn't really a way to manage that centrally in a fashion where you can say, here's the 3 pieces of most critical content that everybody in an organization in a particular group should receive. So that notion is not there. And so some of the challenges in this stage is that it's difficult to gain users' trust because of the inconsistency around how governance is being applied. And it's also hard to get sustained engagement. You may find in this scenario that in this stage that users will come in, they'll start using content, and then they'll stop using it. And you're not sure exactly why that's taking place. So in this stage, what you want to do is really take 3 key steps. You want to institute the idea of certification, right? With governance comes the notion that if you're going to be effective, I need to know what is the content that I should trust. So having an idea that there is a certified content and that's distinguished from non-certified content, and that certified content has an owner that is responsible for that certification. You can also expand governance beyond the idea that I just as a content publisher just put something out there, to the idea that you can have maybe both a silver level certification where it's just the content publisher certifying the content, to up to a gold level certification where there are 2 parties. There's both the content publisher and the business working in concert to say, yes, this content is correct. This uses the nomenclature that is consistent with how the business likes to operate. It is consistent with all the other visualizations that the business uses and the definitions that the business uses around that data. So that and so it's a higher level of trust that's assigned to it. So that idea of multi-tier certification can come in place at this stage of evolution. And then you can also add bursting or distribution. So rather than always relying on the idea that your users will go in and find the content, you're going to come to terms with the reality that people are very busy. They don't have a lot of time. They may not only want to spend a minute or 2 a day on analytics. So let's make sure that they're really engaging with analytics in a way that they're getting value out of them. And to do that, if we know what content is certified, if we know it's valuable for a particular team, let's make sure we distribute that content out to them and push it out to them in a way that's customized and personalized for them, so that in a very proactive way, the portal is and the governance infrastructure is ensuring engagement with the most critical content. Mike will show you some examples of that.
Let's switch across again. Hopefully we'll keep our internet connection this time. So, okay, the concept of certification and what that means. Well, what we're ultimately talking about, as Marius said, is having a way of not only distinguishing certified content, but really understanding the accountability behind it. So in our portal here, what that means is that you'll see some of these tiles here have this sort of green check mark of approval, indicating to the user that it is a piece of content that ultimately is trustworthy because it has been through some sort of process that we'll get into. And not only that it's been certified, but also who's accountable for that certification. So in this case, it's been certified by someone at a particular point in time. So I have that accountability aspect to it. And so how does something get certified? Well, again, it depends on sort of the level that you're at and the type of content that you are publishing. So what it ultimately means is that you need to be able to support different sort of workflows, different publishing workflows, dependent on what you're trying to achieve. And the simplest format might be, again, where the analyst themselves who has created this particular bit of content is responsible for the certification. So what you're looking at here is a publishing workflow in Metric Insights. It's very simple. We synchronize content into a queue, if you like. And as a user, there's content sitting in my queue that I'm responsible for reviewing. That review may be simply that I'm going to go and look at that content and ultimately check it, check the analytics, check the data, check that I'm happy with it. And if I am, I'm going to move that into a completion state where it is ultimately published and certified by myself. And again, the net result of that is that it would end up in our portal here in the categories that are appropriate, available to end users in that certified state. But as Marius said, one of the goals that we're trying to achieve in this stage is to get more of sort of the business buy-in to the content that's getting created and published. And so involving the business users, involving the business stakeholders in the process can help drive that engagement. So it may be that you want a publishing workflow that has an extra step in it, where in this case, as the analyst, things come into my queue that I'm responsible for. Again, I'm responsible for viewing those and looking at them and making sure it's correct. But rather than me publishing it, in this case, I'm going to assign it to our business users and move it to their stage before it gets published. And as a business user, maybe Marius here is now going to have this in his queue, is going to be responsible for signing off on it, and ultimately hold the accountability for moving that into a published and certified state. So again, when it ends up in the front screen here, I now know that maybe it's Marius who's accountable for that certification. If I have questions around it, that's who I can reach out to for more information. So we've moved from sort of that evolutionary stage of just picking and choosing what's going into the portal to having some level of checks and balances and accountability behind it. So we've got our content into the portal in somewhat of a governed fashion now. The second piece then is to start pushing this content out to users so that, again, they don't have to come in every day. If there's a set of content that's interesting to me, I should be able to subscribe to that, or as an analyst, burst that out to users. And so what that might look like is being able to drag tiles maybe into a personal favorites folder or into a shared folder that ultimately I want to distribute out to my users. So I can take that certified content, I can put it into a burst on a schedule that makes sense for that content. I can push it out, obviously, to email, but maybe to another endpoint that's interesting. And I can subscribe users then to that burst. And again, what we're doing here is now not only relying on people to come in and look at that certified content, but actually pushing it out to them so that they can engage with it, in this case, in their email, pulling together that content from different tools, taking those images that we've captured to create a digest or a burst that's particularly relevant to the user that's receiving it. And obviously, they can drill back into that content to go back into the portal and interact with it as they would normally.
Thank you, Mike. So where are we now? So at the second stage, the Middle Ages, if you like, we've gotten to the point where now your users are starting to gain some trust in the content. There's the different levels of certification that help them understand what, to what level something is certified, who's accountable for it. You're starting to drive higher engagement with the content using distribution so that users are looking at the most important content every day. And you've gotten business users involved in the governance process. And you're showing value to the overall user community, because now they understand that when they look in an analytic that is of a, let's say, gold level certification, it's not only that the analyst has said, yes, the data is correct, but somebody from the business is also vouching for this and saying the business definitions for this are accurate. So now you're moving into sort of the Renaissance period, or the third stage. And this is where you can really start accelerating the value that's generated from governance. You already have those two-tier certification in place, you've got bursting in place, but you might be seeing a new set of challenges that are emerging. In that, now that the content is being distributed out to users, now that more people are engaged with the content, data quality issues are becoming more visible. Right? These reports, users are noticing if there's some kind of a data pipelining issue or a delay in getting data out into a particular visualization. That's becoming a higher visibility item. It's also becoming a challenge for users to understand the context around the visualization. So they may know that something is trusted, but do they really understand? What is the data telling me? What does this? This measures sales, but how do we define sales here? Is this just retail sales? Is this sales across the board? What kind of exception cases are being used in defining my territory information? Whatever the data is, having a full understanding around the context for the data may be missing in certain scenarios. And then it's also challenging at this stage. Even though you know you're making progress and you're seeing overall gains, you might not know where the progress is coming from specifically, and which teams are you getting significant engagement from, where everything is firing on all cylinders and the business unit's really using the content effectively, and where are we struggling a little bit? Where do we need to do some education with the content publishers, take a look at improving the way the certification works? And so those are the things that you're facing with in this phase. And so to address that, you focus on a number of areas. First, really extending what we do in terms of governance to add glossary and extended metadata. So often there's lots of information available in the organization around consistent terminology, around added metadata, lineage, various pieces of information around maybe sensitivity around of data, PII. Layering all of that into the visualization experience is an important step in establishing a sense of context with users, so that when they're looking at a visualization, they know not only what number am I looking at, but what does this number mean, and how am I supposed to use this data? Is this highly sensitive data where I'm not even permitted to download it, or is this something that I can go ahead and share freely? And how should I interpret this number? Another piece of it is the data quality. So knowing and understanding there's more visibility around the data, implementing governance processes that will ensure that data quality notifications make it all the way to the end user. It is no value if the data pipelining engineer knows that there's a data quality issue, if the executive using the dashboard based on that data is not also aware of that problem in a proactive way, so that they're not stumbling on it, they're not yelling at somebody or confused about the data that's showing. In fact, instead they know, okay, today this data is delayed, or there's a data quality issue and somebody's looking into it, and I can trust that as soon as the data issue is corrected, I'm going to know when I look at this visualization that it's correct. So, changing the paradigm around how data quality works. And then finally, looking at providing tools to your content publishers that allow them to really understand what's going on with engagement at a detailed level, so they can see which users are actively engaging with content, which are not, which teams are they making progress with, and where do they need to initiate education or other efforts to refresh content to help users with increasing engagement, so that you can have uniform progress across your organization. So Mike will show you some examples of that.
Okay, so let's jump back to our initial portal here. So context, metadata, documentation, what does that look like? Well, as Marius said, it's all about providing sort of the categorization of the content that you're publishing. So if we go back to our original sales analysis example and I click on that tile, what you'll see in this case is I'm actually getting a preview of this content. And so on the left-hand side, I've got an image of what the content looks like, what the dashboard looks like in this case. But on the right-hand side, you'll see a lot of context and categorization around that content. So you'll see that, again, it's been certified by someone. You'll see things like the last time it updated. So the last time the data were updated in Tableau and how current it is. You'll see descriptions. You'll see ownership of the content. You'll see classification of it, perhaps. So, is this internal data? Is it public-facing data? Or is it sensitive information? Does this dashboard contain personal identifiable information, and therefore I should be using it in a particular way? All this sort of context gives me some indication around what it is that this particular report is trying to achieve. It's also tagged with this concept of glossary terms and business definitions. So things like, this dashboard contains sales and units and cost. Well, what do those terms really mean? What is the enterprise definition of sales and units and cost? How are they calculated, and who owns those definitions? Who are the business owners who are responsible for defining those metric APIs, and who are the data stewards responsible for implementing and capturing the data to support it? And where are those metrics being used elsewhere within the catalog of content that we have access to. So again, as a user, before I've even accessed this content, I've got a lot of context, a lot of documentation and categorization around what it is, so that I've got some confidence that I understand how this information should be used, and when I drill into it, I'm confident that this particular asset is going to answer the questions that I have. That also plays into the concept of enabling search within your BI portal or catalog, where by capturing all that metadata that we've spoken about, you should be able to enable your users to search across that body of content that you're creating a library out of. So being able to run search terms as a user, being able to search through the content that I have permissions to see, being able to filter it out by things like, what has been certified in that body of content, what has been certified from a particular source, and be able to drill into that, and you can see it searching through the metadata. So categorization and context around the content. The second piece Mario spoke about is sort of extending the concept of data quality to your users as well. And this can take many forms, but obviously you're going to have some level of checks and balances as part of your data pipelining effort. But using your portal to look at anomalies within that process, whether it be because we're tracking business metrics to see significant changes in any sort of business metrics that exist within the dashboards, or whether we're tracking more sort of technical metrics like we're looking at here, where we're looking at the volume of data that is loaded every day into a particular dashboard, like that Tableau one we were looking at. And using these as indicators to the technical teams of something may be up with the data. So we had that Tableau dashboard. This is counting the number of rows within the data set that is feeding that Tableau dashboard. We can see last night that there was a significant drop in the typical volume that we're getting from that data source. And therefore, that might be something that I want to alert the technical owner of, to say, hey, something unusual happened within the data last night, go check this out. And at the same time, have that communicated automatically to the end users so that there's no surprises when they come in and look at their content. And whether that's through the concept of sort of announcements within your portal, whether that's because you're going to email these users, whether that's because it's specific to a particular piece of content. So again, we're having trouble with the data source behind our Tableau dashboard. Announce that to the users so that there's no surprises when they come in. And again, maintain the trust. Maintaining trust is not about making sure, it's obviously about reducing mistakes and reducing issues, but nothing is 100% perfect all the time. So maintaining trust is about communicating with your users and making sure they're just aware of what's going on. The final piece in this section is around tracking the success of what you're doing. And one way of doing that is looking at things from an engagement perspective. So what is the point of governing your content? Well, it's hopefully to get users using it more and trusting it more and engaging with it more. And so however you do this, you should be tracking at every touch point that content is getting, whether that's because people are receiving it in those burst emails that we looked at, whether they're accessing it in the portal. We want to know how content is being used and who's using it. And so your portal should be tracking that information and be able to give you views on that at any point in time so that you can start to see what content is most popular. So these are reports. This is the number of views they're getting over the last 60 days, what's increasing in popularity, what's going unused within the library that we have, or what's decreasing over time. And using this to better either promote content that isn't being used, better categorize and tag it if it's not being found, or retire it if it's seen its course and is not useful to users anymore. And looking at that at a detailed enough level that you can start to see engagement patterns with the content. So being able to drill in and say, over time, okay, which user groups or users are coming in and looking at the content? Are they looking at it once and then never again like this, and therefore we should be looking at it and seeing how we can improve it, or is there regular engagement with it? And so by tracking all that, we're able to better keep a clean set of governed content within the portal and within the catalog.
Thank you, Mike. So at the end of this Renaissance period, if you like, of stage 3, you've gotten increased data quality confidence because your users know and understand they can trust the data. They know whenever there's an issue that there's proactive actions being taken. You're presenting the content within context, so business users understand what the data is that they're looking at, how they should interpret it, all the metadata that surrounds it, and how that should affect their interaction with it. You've enabled discoverability in an intelligent way, so I, as a user, can come in and, using a particular business term, can find all the certified relevant content around that particular topic. So I can really do effective analysis. And you really have provided the tools to your content publishers that allow user engagement to be optimized and for the ongoing steps to be taken to improve engagement within a particular team or group based on what's going on within that particular organization. So now, the final stage, what we like to think of as industrial revolution. This is the stage where you really are stepping on the gas and automating what came before, right? So you're looking at pulling in that final level of BI governance in place. So here you've got content, it's getting published, it's getting certified, and there's tagging happening broadly. Business analysts are using the tracking tools. All that's going really well. And your challenges, perhaps, in this area are more of a longer tail type problem. In other words, you have to think about, well, what's the process that exists to reevaluate content? Sure, this content was certified 6 months ago or a year ago, but is it still viable today? If it's changed, does it need to undergo recertification? If it was certified but the business has changed, are we reevaluating it to ensure that it's still correct? There might be some challenges as far as overall integration. You have all this additional metadata in your organization. You may have data catalogs in place, whether they're off-the-shelf tools or something you've built yourself, where you've captured metadata in an Elation or a Calibra or something like that. And you want to be able to enable value from that. How do you integrate that into the governance landscape? And then how do you get the data teams involved in this as well, so that you have that group, not only the content publishers and the business users, but also the data pipeline engineers, the data governance teams. How can they be involved in the whole governance process? So here you're looking at really enabling 3 different areas of change. Introducing a platinum certification level, one where the data pipeline engineers or the data governance team is involved in the process, and you're certifying both the analytic, the business terminology, and the data all together. You're looking at recertification processes and enabling automation around recertification. And you're looking at data catalog integration. So you're bringing all of that data catalog metadata that you've captured in other tools, integrating it into the portal, into the user consumption experience, so that you can generate a lot of more value out of that information. Mike will show you how that looks.
Okay, let's jump back to the product one more time. So what might sort of the ultimate workflow look like? This concept of sort of a platinum publishing workflow in your portal. Well, as you can imagine, it's really just about having another stage within the process. So if we go back to sort of our publishing view here, We have these different queues where different people have responsibilities for each stage. And if you think about what we've done in the previous sort of pieces of the presentation, the previous eras, if you like, we've synchronized content, we've added metadata, we've checked it, and ultimately we've published and certified it. Well, divvying up the responsibility for that across the different tiers is really what we're talking about here. So as a developer, when I get a piece of content within my queue, I may be responsible for, say, making sure we've got a good description, ultimately assigning it a certain category, but ultimately, just checking that it's what I want and that it's appropriate for the problem that I built it for. When it goes to the business user, they may be ultimately responsible for adding the correct definitions to it and attaching documentation to the content, so that again their colleagues know exactly what it is and what it means to it. And then finally, the data steward may be responsible for coming in and checking the underlying data before it gets moved into that published state. So you can again sort of share out the responsibilities of each of those stages and those people. So having that concept of a platinum certification, the other thing, so this is the definition behind that certification workflow. So you can see we've got a number of stages here that we were just talking about. One of the things that your workflow should be able to do, if I zoom in here, is to allow this concept of recertification. And so maybe there's some critical reports in your environment that when the data updates, maybe it's your monthly financial reports that go out to the board or something. When the data updates, you actually want to decertify those elements and push them back into the workflow and make sure it goes through those checks and balances again. And it might not have to go all the way back to the beginning. It might just have to go back to the business, for example, so that they can review it again, make sure they're confident in it, have the data checked, and then get it certified again. So putting in that level of automation to make sure that it's not a one-time thing. BI is never a one-time thing. Governance is never a one-time thing. Having the checks and balances in place where appropriate to recertify content is needed as well. And the final thing I'm going to touch on before we wrap up and answer any questions that there might be is, the question often becomes that there's some level of data governance happening in a lot of organizations today, whether that's with tools like I've got here, say Elation or Calibra, whether you're using sort of open source technologies. These tools are very sort of focused at the technical folks who are cataloging the data and the tables and the columns on the back end. But this information rarely gets in front of the users of the content. However, if you are maintaining a data catalog to sort of generate added value of that, you should be able to synchronize your portal with your data catalog. And what do we mean by that? Well, ensuring that if you're tagging content or tables or metrics within the data catalog, that when you publish a piece of content that contains that content in the portal, that you're automatically pulling that metadata through so that users who are using the content can see it and again, understand that information and that context behind it. So leveraging any work that you've done today. Let's jump through to the end.
Okay, so thank you, Mike. So I think the key takeaway that we want you to walk away with from this before we go into Q&A is that the BI governance process is an evolutionary process. It must be done in stages. We've laid out here what we sometimes see as the key hallmarks of each of the different stages and some of the things you can do in each stage. And that might vary a bit from organization to organization, but the key underlying principle, if you like, that you want to make sure you're executing with is having a sober assessment of what stage are you really at, and then what is the specific next steps that you can take where you can generate incremental value and prove out the value of governance within your organization such that you can build up the capital to apply towards the next stage of evolution. Right? And with that approach, then you're not boiling the ocean. You're not trying to get immediately to the finish line and introduce something into an organization where they simply that's not ready to adopt it. But instead, you're gradually evolving the BI governance in your organization along with it into a data-centric and governance-centric organization because they're seeing value at every step in the process. So with that, let's move to the Q&A.
Yeah, so I see we've got a couple of questions coming in here. First one is, does a RACI matrix utilization fit into this?
Yeah, so yes. So basically, the idea is that you're assigning roles and responsibilities to individual kind of personas, if you like, and that they would then be responsible for particular governance actions. And that is very much the approach that you should take to BI governance. And it's very important, whatever technology you use to do that kind of the process that Mike showed, where you're onboarding content onto your portal, you want to make sure that it allows you the flexibility to define which particular role has specific things they need to do, and then take those actions. So an example, Mike showed you, I think there was the one where the business user role might be responsible for tagging or for adding documentation associating with business terms. Perhaps the data steward is responsible for specifying the final level of certification. The content publisher might be responsible for associating release notes or defining key metadata fields. You want to have the flexibility to define those roles and responsibilities, what parts of the certification process they need to manage, and then make sure that your workflow supports that.
Okay, second question we have here is, we're struggling to get started with assessing our BI governance processes. Any advice?
I think that the assessment is the first step, and it's really looking at, if you looked at kind of how we did the presentations, looking where the pain points are. And so again, because that first step you take has to, by definition, has to generate value in order for you to be able to do a second step, because notoriously governance initiatives fail because you start going and then the organization loses attention. So you can't afford to do that. You've got to have an early win. So in order to do that, the best approach is to say, what are the greatest pain points that the organization is facing today from a governance perspective? And then package up that first set, the things you do in that stage one, specifically around those items. Right? And that's much more important than any particular methodology or anything else. It's just really focus on value and then roll that value forward into additional items.
Yeah, and I would say, don't govern for govern's sake, right? It's some content. Reality is it probably doesn't need a high level of governance around it. So understanding sort of the types of content you have and where governance is required, and what that means, as Marius said, so it could simply mean that some documentation on your assets will add an incredible amount of value to the people using it because they'll understand it more. So looking at it from either a pain point or an opportunity, right? If we tag this content better, people will be able to find it, and I wouldn't be getting 100 phone calls every day asking for the same report that's already out there. So understanding pain points, understanding opportunity, and then not just doing it for the sake of it, making sure that it's relevant to the types of content that you have.
Yeah, and if you're not sure, ask your users. I mean, it's easy enough to do a survey the community, understand, what are their biggest pain points? Are they around trust? Are they around, understanding what the content is, et cetera? And then that gives you some of the ammunition to be able to go to management and say, look, here's what's happening. Here's what our engagement numbers look like overall. Here's what our users are saying as to why they're not engaging. And here are the specific governance steps that we think we can take to make the first down payment towards improving the situation.
The next question, I suspect there's not one answer to this, Marius, but basically, who owns governance?
Yeah, I think there shouldn't be a single answer, in the sense that you often can have a governance team that is sort of executing this and organizing that, and that's within the BI area usually. You want to have the ultimate stakeholder ownership of governance as a whole should be somebody very senior in the organization. A VP of analytics or a CIO or somebody of that nature should be one standing behind this and saying, yes, governance is important, because you do need broad-based adoption. And then you need to have a diffuse set of responsibilities that go out. So the content publishers have a certain ownership that they need around their content. There's the business users that have a certain set of responsibilities. So it's something that needs to be done in a way that's very thoughtful, with a set of roles, responsibilities, and a place where you have those three pieces all fit together. You've got the right roles defined with the right responsibilities. You've got the right processes to support those roles, and then you have some kind of technology that automates those processes and enables everything to happen effectively. So you've got to think through that entire package and that solution and implement that all together.
I think practically we've seen different examples, right? I mean, sometimes it does get owned by the BI teams, but sometimes it does get owned by governance teams, regardless of where it's owned. I don't think you can run governance in a silo. I think that's what you're saying, Marius, is, if I own it and I'm on the BI team, I still have to go out and make sure I get buy-in from stakeholders and those other groups. Otherwise, it's going to fail.
That's a great distinction.
It's a good question. Can there be two different data catalogs, one for dev teams focusing more on technical details and another one for business users focusing on definition and business rules applied? Would this be something that's recommended at all? So the answer is generally yes, right? I think, I'll take a stab and then you jump in. I think in organizations where governance has come quite a long way, we see that, right? So there are the sort of quote unquote data catalogs out there where it is more of a technical effort. It's where an analyst will go to understand perhaps what databases or data sets they should be working with to build their analytics, so that they can ensure they're using the right data. But then it's more of a sort of portal solution that we've been looking at, where the business definitions of those analytics and the definitions of the metrics are shown and cataloged for the end users. And the important thing is that you're not sort of replicating, that you're synchronizing those efforts together. You're making sure the relevant information in the data catalog is flooding through to the business catalog for the end users. It's not everything typically, it's just what's important to those users.
Yeah, I would also add that we didn't really cover this in detail in this presentation, but there should be the idea that you're going to surface the right information to the right audience. So when you're interacting with a piece of content in the portal, if you are the analyst, then you should have access to lineage, for example, that is going to be helpful for you to understand where does this data come from, glossary terms that are relevant to you, perhaps attributes associated with the data set that a particular visualization is based on, because you're coming into it with the idea that I'm going to be trying to find a visualization I'm going to build something off of or use as a template for something else. Whereas if you're a business user, you're just much more concerned with what does this data mean, what are the business definitions, etc. So absolutely, there can be multiple glossaries, multiple catalogs that should feed into this whole comprehensive catalog portal experience, and then you want to make sure that you're surfacing the right level of information to the right audience.
And there's kind of a follow-up question that's just popped up. Steps you recommend for the integration of the data catalog? Well, I think the steps are ultimately, so what does integration mean? It basically means mapping certain metadata fields together. So if I've got a Tableau report that has certain fields associated with it, and those fields have been captured within the underlying data catalog, I want to be able to synchronize those. But what are the steps? It's about making sure that I've identified which fields, which metadata fields within the data catalog are going to be useful to the end users, synchronize those so that when a piece of content is published, we automatically pick up the relevant fields and make sure that goes out to users.
And I'll add one other piece of nuance to that is because governance tends to be a distributed function, you might have a centralized compliance team that's managing the PII status of particular visualizations, and they're doing that in Excel spreadsheets or in a SharePoint list. And then you've got some other team that's managing the lineage information, and that's in a Calibra or an Olation. Because there's multiple sources, you need a strategy whereby all that can be synchronized into a central place, from all those different sources. So different pieces will be synchronized from different places.
And we've just been given time by our hosts here, so unfortunately we didn't get to all the questions, but we will make sure we answer those offline. I guess I'll hand it back to you, Eric.
Great. Thank you, Marius and Mike, for an amazing panel discussion. And thanks everyone for joining us today for this fantastic webinar. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.